December 25, 1875, a day meant for celebration, family gatherings, and the warmth of the holiday spirit became a day of tragedy in Clinton, Mississippi. Charles Caldwell, a man whose courage had quietly shaped the lives of those around him, was brutally taken from the world. Lured by someone he trusted, he fell victim to a violent mob, shot in the back of the head in a shocking act that reverberated across the state and captured the nation's attention. His death was not just the loss of a single life. It was a stark reminder of the dangers faced by those who dared to challenge injustice in a society struggling to embrace equality. Caldwell was no ordinary man. Born into the harsh reality of slavery in the 1830s, he had risen against immense odds to become a symbol of resilience, leadership, and hope for his community. While many stories of the era focus on generals and public figures adorned with medals, Caldwell's battlefield was different. It was a battle fought not with guns and armies, but with intelligence, courage, and an unyielding commitment to justice. He stood as a voice for the voiceless, advocating for rights and opportunities that others were denied simply because of the color of their skin. The Christmas that ended in tragedy was supposed to be a time of reflection and joy. Instead, it became a moment that illustrated the fragility of progress in post-Civil War Mississippi. Yet, even in the face of such a violent act, Caldwell's story is not just one of despair, it is a testament to bravery that refuses to be silenced. He had survived countless challenges in his life: the brutalities of slavery, the systemic denial of education, and the threats of political violence. Each obstacle he overcame was a step toward a more just society, and each act of courage left an indelible mark on those who knew him and those who would come after. Today, as we uncover the life of Charles Caldwell, we explore not only his final moments, but the extraordinary journey that led him there. His story is filled with lessons about resilience, the power of standing up for what is right, and the importance of remembering those who fought in the shadows of history. It challenges us to consider the many untold stories of courage that history books often overlook, and inspires us to reflect on the ongoing fight for equality and justice in our own times. Before we dive deeper into Caldwell's remarkable life, do not forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you never miss another story that brings history to life. By sharing and subscribing, you help keep these important stories alive and inspire others to learn from the past. Now, let us journey into the life of a man whose bravery changed the course of history, and whose legacy continues to challenge us to stand up for what is right, even when the odds seem insurmountable. In the early 1830s, in the heart of Mississippi, a child named Caldwell entered a world defined by boundaries he had never chosen and hardships he could not yet comprehend. His earliest memories were shaped not by freedom, but by the suffocating weight of slavery, a system that dictated the course of his life before he could even form his own dreams. For Caldwell, childhood was not filled with the laughter and play that many take for granted, but with the constant rhythm of labor, the commands of overseers, and the unyielding realization that his life was controlled by others. Every morning the sun rose not as a promise of new possibilities, but as a reminder of duties waiting to be performed, of survival carried out under conditions designed to break spirits and silence voices. Yet within these oppressive circumstances, Caldwell's story began to form into something greater than the chains that bound him. He grew up with an awareness that his life carried meaning beyond what those in power had allowed him to believe. Even as a child, when he watched others toil beside him, he noticed the quiet resilience that persisted in the human spirit, that unspoken refusal to be completely subdued. Caldwell absorbed lessons, not from books or formal schooling, those were denied to him, but from the whispered conversations of elders, the coded songs sung in the fields, and the careful glances exchanged in the shadows of long days. These fragments of resistance became his education, teaching him that dignity could survive even in places where cruelty sought to erase it. As Caldwell entered his teenage years, he became acutely aware of how the system around him was designed to suppress not just bodies but minds and futures. He witnessed families torn apart, the weight of grief etched into the faces of people who had no power to prevent separation. He learned to measure trust carefully, for betrayal was often encouraged by those who sought to maintain control. But despite these endless reminders of human suffering, Caldwell carried within himself a spark that refused to be extinguished. He began to cultivate a vision of life that was not dictated by servitude, a life where his own choices mattered. The 1830s and 1840s in Mississippi were not only years of personal struggle for Caldwell, but also decades of increasing tension in the nation at large. While he labored under the system, whispers of resistance and change filtered through, carried by traveling preachers, by fugitives who had tasted freedom, and by the stories that managed to reach even the most guarded corners of plantations. Caldwell listened closely to these stories, recognizing in them a mirror of his own unspoken hopes. These voices of defiance became the threads weaving into the fabric of his resolve, shaping the man he was becoming. By the time Caldwell entered adulthood, the boy who had once been forced to bend under the demands of others had grown into someone who carried within him an unshakable sense of identity. The scars of his early years did not weaken him. They became reminders of what he had endured and why he could never allow his life to be defined solely by oppression. The lessons of his youth: endurance, vigilance, and the necessity of holding on to hope prepared him for the trials that lay ahead. Caldwell's birth in the 1830s was not the beginning of a tragic story that ended in silence. It was the beginning of a journey that revealed how one life, even when subjected to unimaginable hardship, could illuminate the truth of resilience and the unbreakable human will. His existence challenged the assumptions of those who believed that slavery could erase individuality and spirit. Instead, from his earliest days, Caldwell's life became a testament to endurance, to the possibility that even in the harshest conditions, strength could take root. As he grew, his path was shaped by forces far beyond his control, yet he never surrendered the quiet belief that he was destined for something more. In the shadow of slavery's brutality, he carried a flame of perseverance that could not be dimmed. This flame would guide him through the shifting landscapes of his time, carrying him from the dark beginnings of his birth in bondage toward the legacy he would eventually leave behind, a legacy not just of survival, but of defiance and of a life that refused to be forgotten. From the earliest years of his life, Caldwell grew up in a world where survival itself demanded extraordinary resilience. For those around him were forced to endure conditions that would break the spirit of most human beings. Each day was marked by exhausting labor under an unforgiving sun, the kind of work that stretched from dawn until well past the point when the body should have been allowed to rest, and yet there was no relief because the cycle of toil seemed endless. The men, women, and children who lived in these conditions were expected to extract every ounce of strength from their bodies, not because it brought them prosperity, but because others claimed ownership over their time, their energy, and their very existence. To face such unrelenting demands, while knowing that there was no escape from the harsh rhythm of each day, required a depth of endurance that few outside this world could fully comprehend. Food, which should have been a source of nourishment and comfort, was scarcely provided in amounts sufficient to sustain human life. Meager rations left bellies empty and bodies weakened. Yet people had no choice but to continue pushing through fields or workshops with barely enough strength to carry on. The lack of nutrition was not merely an inconvenience, but a calculated deprivation, ensuring that those living under such conditions would always remain vulnerable, their energy consumed by survival rather than resistance. The same deprivation extended to clothing, where tattered garments provided little defense against the elements, leaving people exposed to cold, rain, or blistering heat. their dignity further eroded by the denial of even the simplest human needs. Living conditions themselves compounded the suffering, for shelters were overcrowded, unsanitary, and far from safe. Disease spread easily in such environments, where clean water was rare and medical care was almost non-existent, turning preventable ailments into life-threatening crises. For children, the fragility of life was starkly clear, as mortality rates were heartbreakingly high, and mothers and fathers often grieved losses that came with devastating frequency. Families carried the burden of these losses quietly, as grief had no outlet in a world where survival demanded that the living continue working despite the weight of sorrow. The death of a child did not stop the fields from needing to be worked, nor did illness exempt anyone from the daily grind, and so personal tragedy was absorbed into a cycle of relentless labor. And yet, even under such extreme conditions, there was an undeniable strength that radiated from those who endured. They found ways to hold on to one another, to share what little they had, to sing songs that carried memories of home and hope for the future, and to keep alive traditions that reminded them of their humanity when everything around them sought to deny it. Within their stories, prayers, and whispered conversations at night, there was a spark of resistance, not through open rebellion at every moment, but through the act of surviving and protecting each other as spirit. Caldwell grew up surrounded by this quiet but unbreakable resilience, watching how his elders carried themselves with dignity even when the world tried to strip it away. For him, these early experiences shaped not only his understanding of suffering but also his appreciation for courage. To see strength emerge from such desperate circumstances, to watch mothers cradle infants with tenderness even as they feared for their survival, or to hear the laughter of children playing despite the overwhelming odds stacked against them, was to witness a truth that could not be erased, that even in the darkest environments, humanity persisted. Caldwell absorbed this lesson as naturally as breathing, carrying with him the awareness that no matter how oppressive the forces around them might be, there remained a deep well of endurance and spirit within his community. This backdrop of hardship became the soil in which his own sense of justice and determination took root. It was not merely the cruelty of the system that left an impression on him, but the unwavering humanity of those who endured it. Each act of survival, each moment of kindness shared among people with almost nothing to give, carved a lasting memory into his heart, shaping him into someone who could never forget what it meant to fight for dignity. His journey would later take him far from these childhood experiences, but their influence was impossible to escape, for they became the very foundation of the man he would become. As Caldwell grew older, the weight of these memories did not fade, but instead deepened his sense of responsibility. He had seen suffering up close, he had felt hunger gnaw at his own body, and he had witnessed death arrive far too soon for many of those around him. Yet he had also seen the spark of resilience survive in places where it had no right to exist. This duality, the cruelty of his circumstances and the strength of his community, formed the lens through which he viewed the world, and it would one day drive him to take risks that few others would dare. His story, though marked by tragedy, was also illuminated by the endurance of those who taught him that to live, even in the harshest conditions, was itself an act of defiance against a world that sought to crush their spirit. The lives of enslaved women in the American South carried a weight that was both visible and invisible, a burden woven into every hour of their existence. Beyond the relentless toil in fields and homes, there lingered an ever-present fear that stripped them of safety and dignity. Women lived under constant scrutiny, knowing that their bodies were not entirely their own, and the lines between survival and despair blurred in ways that left lasting scars. These women were daughters, sisters, wives, and mothers, yet their humanity was often overlooked, and their voices silenced beneath the demands of those who held power over their daily lives. For many of them, the home which should have been a place of comfort, became instead another site where they faced exploitation, and the family bonds they tried to preserve were constantly threatened by forces far beyond their control. The men who shared this suffering felt the pain deeply, not only for themselves but for the women they loved. Fathers could not shield their daughters. Husbands could not always guard their wives. And brothers were left powerless to defend their sisters. The rules of the system were crafted deliberately to rob them of that fundamental role of protector, forcing them to watch helplessly as the people closest to them bore injustices they could not stop. For Matt, this loss was more than physical helplessness, it was a wound to his identity, a forced stripping of his ability to fulfill the responsibilities that gave him meaning and pride. The anguish of witnessing such harm, knowing it could not be prevented, left many broken inside, carrying silent grief that lingered through generations. Yet even in the midst of these circumstances, resilience found a way to endure. Women developed quiet strategies of survival, finding strength in faith, in whispered songs, and in the comfort of each other's company. They shared wisdom passed down through stories, recipes, herbal remedies, and the oral traditions that kept alive the sense of belonging to something larger than their oppression. These small acts of resistance were not dramatic, but they were powerful. Each moment of survival, each decision to keep moving forward, was an act of defiance against a system designed to erase their humanity. For men, the struggle was to hold on to dignity in a world determined to strip it away. While they could not always shield their families from harm, many fought in quieter ways. They worked tirelessly to maintain hope, to teach their children strength, to pass down lessons of endurance. Fathers taught sons to stand tall despite the chains, while brothers reassured sisters that they were loved and valued, even in circumstances where their authority was deliberately undermined. These men clung to their roles as pillars of their families, their silent devotions speaking louder than the laws and customs designed to diminish them. The trauma of these realities did not remain confined to one generation. It seeped into memory, into the stories told long after, and into the ways that families shaped their identities. The pain of not being able to protect loved ones left a legacy of both sorrow and determination. For many descendants, the knowledge of what their ancestors endured became a source of strength, a reminder of endurance through unimaginable trials. The memory of women who survived despite being treated as powerless, and men who found ways to hold families together against impossible odds, formed the foundation of a narrative of resilience. In telling these stories, one cannot ignore the immense cost. Every moment of powerlessness left its mark, and every act of resilience came at a price. But through it all, the humanity of those who endured never disappeared, even when others tried to deny it. Their love for each other, their quiet resistance, and their determination to survive created a legacy that continues to inspire. The pain of the past was real, but so too was the strength that rose in its shadow, a strength that turned silence into song and suffering into stories that refuse to be forgotten. These narratives remind us that history is not only written in laws and battles, but in the intimate struggles of families trying to remain whole under conditions designed to tear them apart. Black women endured unspeakable violations of their dignity, yet they carried on, raising children, preserving culture, and planting the seeds of hope. Black men were forced into roles of silence, yet in that silence they found ways to love, to protect in spirit when they could not in action, and to pass on strength through words, guidance, and presence. Together, they shaped a history of survival that could not be erased, even by the harshest attempts to suppress it. The past is filled with these moments of quiet heroism, where the will to live and the determination to protect what little could be preserved created meaning amid despair. These stories demand remembrance, not as tales of suffering alone, but as examples of a strength so profound that it reached across centuries. By carrying their stories forward, we do more than honor their memory, we allow their resilience to illuminate our understanding of the human spirit, showing us that even in times of unimaginable darkness, love, courage, and dignity can endure. In Mississippi, the system of laws that governed the lives of enslaved people was crafted with a precision that left little room for humanity. Reducing men, women, and children into objects within a rigid framework of property rights. And through these laws, every aspect of their existence was controlled. From where they could walk to what they could dream of becoming. Movement was not a simple freedom, but a privilege that could be revoked at any moment, as passes were required to leave the plantation, and patrols enforced this order with vigilance, ensuring that the smallest step beyond prescribed boundaries could result in punishment or suspicion. Such measures were not only designed to keep people physically confined, but also to break down the idea of autonomy, to remind them constantly that their lives were not their own but dictated by those who claimed ownership over them. Gatherings of any kind were viewed as dangerous, because the law treated assembly not as a natural human impulse to connect, but as a potential act of rebellion. And so even moments of community, of sharing stories or faith, were shadowed by the risk of discovery and reprisal. Education, too, was denied, for knowledge was seen as a threat to the balance of power, and teaching someone to read or write was often criminalized, leaving generations deprived of the tools that could open doors beyond servitude. The intent was clear: to prevent the growth of ideas that might challenge the system, to silence the written word that could inspire freedom, and to ensure that hope itself would be contained. Legal rights were stripped to the bare minimum, for in courts, the voice of an enslaved person carried little weight, often dismissed outright when set against the testimony of those who held them in bondage, and justice became another tool of control rather than a shield of protection. These laws did not exist in isolation but intertwined with the daily realities of labor, deprivation, and family separation, forming a structure that reinforced the idea that people could be categorized as property, while their humanity was ignored. Yet within this suffocating system, resilience persisted, for people found ways to carve out spaces of dignity, whether through whispered prayers, songs that carried coded meanings, or quiet acts of defiance that kept their spirit alive. The cruelty of the laws in Mississippi reveals not only the mechanics of oppression, but also the fear that lay behind them. A fear harbored by those in power who knew that if given freedom of movement, the chance to gather, the gift of education, and the protection of fair legal standing, the very foundation of slavery would collapse under the strength and brilliance of the human beings they sought to suppress. It was this recognition that knowledge could awaken courage, that community could spark resistance, and that freedom of movement could lead to escape that drove lawmakers to tighten their grip. But history reminds us that no law, however cruel, can extinguish the innate yearning for freedom. In the dimly lit cabins and the quiet corners of the plantation, Caldwell and others like him nurtured a dangerous yet powerful ambition, one that had been denied to them by laws and reinforced by harsh social order: the ability to read and write. To the outside world, they were expected to remain uneducated, to accept the idea that knowledge was beyond their reach. But in secret, they defied this imposed ignorance. The act of learning letters, of recognizing words and shaping sentences, was more than just an intellectual pursuit. It was an act of quiet rebellion, a declaration that their minds belonged to them even if their lives did not. Caldwell knew that if he were caught, the punishment would be swift and cruel, yet he persisted, driven by the belief that knowledge held a kind of freedom that chains could never fully restrain. There were nights when the risks felt overwhelming, when every sound outside the cabin sent a jolt of fear through the small gathering of learners. Yet those stolen moments with a scrap of paper or a charred stick used to scratch words into the dirt became their sanctuary. In these hidden classrooms, they built not just literacy but resilience, passing whispered lessons from one to another, each syllable carrying the weight of defiance. Some taught by recalling fragments of prayers or passages overheard in church, while others memorized the shape of words glimpsed on signs or pages that were quickly tucked away before an overseer could appear. Knowledge moved quietly, like a secret river beneath the surface of oppression, carving a path towards something larger than themselves. For Caldwell, learning to write his name was not a small victory, but a profound affirmation of identity. A way of saying to the world that he was not just property to be catalogued, but a human being with a voice. However faint it might have seemed at the time, the first time he managed to form those letters, uneven though they were, he felt a spark that no punishment could extinguish. Writing was a way of leaving a trace, a way of saying, I was here. I mattered, and my story cannot be erased. It connected him to generations before him who had been denied this chance and to those who would come after, carrying the seeds of hope planted in secret. The danger of discovery loomed constantly. Overseers and masters were aware that literacy could plant dangerous ideas, that it could foster organization and challenge the rigid boundaries they had constructed. To prevent this, they enforced laws that treated even a whispered lesson as a transgression. But this only strengthened Caldwell's determination. He understood that the written word could open doors to scripture, to knowledge of the world beyond the plantation, and even to the idea of freedom itself. In each letter he learned, he saw a fragment of liberation, a small key to a locked door. The community of learners forged bonds in these clandestine lessons, bonds that extended beyond family ties. They became each other's protectors and confidants, sharing not only knowledge but also courage. When one of them stumbled over a word, another would quietly encourage. And when doubt crept in, the group reminded themselves why they risked so much. They dreamed of writing letters to loved ones, of understanding documents that shaped their lives without their consent, of reading sacred texts with their own eyes rather than depending on filtered interpretations. Each of these dreams gave meaning to the risk, transforming fear into determination. What made their struggle even more remarkable was how ordinary objects took on extraordinary significance. A piece of charcoal became a pen, the bare earth a notebook, a fragment of discarded newspaper a treasured book. Caldwell remembered the way they would huddle around a single torn page, studying each line as though it were a priceless artifact, memorizing words so they could be carried back into the darkness of the cabins, repeated and practiced until they were etched into memory. These scraps of knowledge, once scattered, began to form a greater whole, weaving together the possibility of a future where literacy would not have to be stolen but openly pursued. As Caldwell's understanding grew, so too did his awareness of the world beyond the confines of the plantation. He began to recognize the names of towns, the meaning of laws, the promises contained in sacred texts that spoke of freedom and justice. Each word he learned expanded the boundaries of his world, reminding him that even if he could not yet step freely into that larger world, his mind was already crossing those borders. Literacy became both a weapon and a shield, a way to resist invisibility and to claim humanity in a system designed to deny it. In the quiet of those secret gatherings, surrounded by the shadows of fear, Caldwell discovered a truth that would sustain him. Knowledge could not be entirely chained. The lessons whispered in darkness carried into the light, shaping not only his destiny, but the collective memory of all who dared to defy the silence imposed upon them. He realized that every word learned in secret was a promise to the future, a promise that their voices would not be lost, that their stories would endure, and though the risks never vanished, the conviction that learning could shape a different tomorrow gave them strength to continue. In the end, Caldwell's courage was not only in the act of picking up letters and words, but in the choice to believe that his mind was worthy of growth, that his spirit was stronger than fear, and that knowledge could sow seeds of freedom even in the hardest soil. It was a resistance fought not with weapons but with words, not with open confrontation but with quiet determination. Yet its impact reached far beyond those dimly lit cabins. His story, like the story of many others who risked everything for the right to learn, reminds us that the pursuit of knowledge is itself an act of defiance against any system that seeks to diminish human dignity, and that even in silence, voices find a way to be heard. In Clinton, where the heat of Mississippi summers pressed down on the small town, the rhythmic sound of hammer striking iron began to carry a weight of its own. Caldwell, once a boy who had quietly traced letters in the dirt by candlelight, had grown into a man whose strength and skill could not be ignored. The forge became his sanctuary, a place where sparks flew like fragments of his unyielding spirit, and each glowing piece of iron that bent under his hammers reflected not just craftsmanship but determination. With every horseshoe fitted, every tool repaired, and every intricate piece of ironwork shaped, his presence grew into something that could not be reduced to a number on a ledger or a name in a registry. The townspeople who came to him for work began to see more than just a man standing behind the fire. They saw a craftsman whose skill demanded respect and whose character earned trust. In a society designed to deny him recognition, Caldwell carved out a space where he could not be dismissed so easily. Children gathered at the edge of the workshop, wide-eyed as they watched him coax stubborn metal into graceful forms, while older men leaned on fences and quietly admitted that no one else could quite manage a plow blade like Caldwell. Even those who rarely allowed themselves to look past the boundaries imposed by law and custom could not deny that his hands shaped iron in ways that few others could master. The forge, with its roaring fire and ceaseless rhythm, became a symbol of something larger than labor. It became a testament to resilience, proof that skill and perseverance could create respect even in a world designed to deny it. In Clinton's small but growing community, Caldwell's reputation carried beyond the boundaries of his workshop. Farmers brought him their tools, women came with broken latches, and travelers stopped to watch as he shaped iron into necessity and art. For many, his work was not just about repairing what was broken, but about holding together the fragile fabric of daily life. Each service rendered became an unspoken declaration that he mattered, that his presence was indispensable, and that his place in the town was not merely tolerated but quietly valued. Though the laws of Mississippi sought to define him narrowly, those who relied on his skill found themselves seeing something broader, something closer to truth. Caldwell's forge was not only a center of work but a gathering place. In the evenings, as the fire dimmed and the ringing of hammer on anvil softened, people lingered, talking quietly about harvests, weather, and the small rhythms of rural life. Caldwell, who had risked everything to learn letters in secret, listened carefully, absorbing not just words but the cadence of community. With each conversation, his understanding of people deepened, and his own sense of belonging grew, though he still lived under restrictions that sought to limit his freedom. His workshop granted him a measure of autonomy that few others around him could imagine. Here, he set the terms of his labor, measured the worth of his skill, and built a reputation that could not be ignored. That reputation gave him something rare: respect. It was not the fleeting acknowledgement that came from a passing nod, nor the hollow recognition offered out of politeness. It was genuine, born from reliance, from the knowledge that without Caldwell's work, the town's stools would dull, its horses would limp, and its farms would falter. Respect grew not from what society permitted but from what necessity demanded. And Caldwell, with his iron and fire, became indispensable. For a man who had once been forced to whisper lessons of reading in secrecy, this recognition was profound, a quiet triumph forged in heat and sweat. The forge also gave Caldwell a vision beyond his own survival. He began to see the possibilities that lay in teaching others, in sharing not only the secrets of iron but the lessons of resilience and self-worth. Young men sought him out, eager to learn how to hold a hammer, how to read the glow of heated metal, how to turn raw force into delicate balance. In teaching them, Caldwell passed on more than a trade. He passed on the belief that dignity could be shaped, like iron, through patience and determination. In time, his influence reached further than the limits of Clinton. Travelers spoke of him in nearby towns, telling stories of a blacksmith whose work bore the marks of precision and pride. For Caldwell, each tale carried away was a victory, each recognition a crack in the barriers that laws tried to enforce. He had not broken free of the restrictions that bound him, but within the ring of his hammer and the roar of his forge, he had found a measure of freedom no law could take away. The forge's fire illuminated not only the iron before him, but also the path he was carving for himself and for those who would follow. His life was still shaped by limitations imposed from outside. Yet within those confines he built something lasting, something powerful enough to inspire respect and hope. Caldwell had become more than a blacksmith. He had become a symbol of persistence, of a man who shaped not only metal but his own place in a world determined to deny him. His autonomy was fragile, but it was real, and it burned as brightly as the sparks that leapt each time his hammer met iron. When the Civil War finally drew to a close and the South lay in ruins, the old social order shaken but not yet fully dismantled, Caldwell stood at a crossroads in his own life. He had already endured the weight of oppression, had seized opportunities to learn when learning itself was forbidden to him, and had forged a place for himself as a skilled blacksmith whose hands not only shaped iron, but also carved out a measure of independence and respect. Now, in the uncertain dawn of Reconstruction, he chose not to retreat into quiet survival, but instead to step into the world of politics, where the battles were no longer fought with muskets, but with words, laws, and ideals. His decision to take part in the 1868 Mississippi Constitutional Convention was not born out of ambition alone. It was the natural continuation of a life that had been defined by resilience, determination, and the belief that he and those like him deserved a voice in shaping the society that had long denied them one. The convention itself was historic, a gathering where men from vastly different walks of life, planters, lawyers, farmers, freedmen, sat together to debate the future of Mississippi. For Caldwell, simply being present in that chamber was an act of defiance against centuries of exclusion. He carried with him not just his own story, but the unspoken stories of countless others who had been silenced. When he rose to speak, he did so with the gravity of one who understood that words had the power to reshape lives. The issues before the convention were monumental: education, suffrage, civil rights, and the very structure of governance in a state that had resisted change for so long. Caldwell lent his voice to the radical notion that freedom must mean more than the absence of chains. It had to mean opportunity, dignity, and full participation in civic life. Though he had never been trained in the art of politics in the way his white counterparts had, Caldwell possessed a sharp mind honed by necessity and an instinct for justice born out of lived experience. His contributions reflected not only the aspirations of freedmen, but also the pragmatism of a man who knew the difficulties that lay ahead. He pushed for public education, understanding that the forbidden knowledge he had once risked so much to gain should now be open to all. He advocated for equal rights, recognizing that true freedom required more than declarations. It required enforcement through laws and institutions. Each time he raised his voice, he challenged those around him to see beyond the old hierarchies and to imagine a state where fairness was more than rhetoric. The convention set the stage for Caldwell's next great role. Having proven his mettle among the delegates, he went on to serve in the Mississippi State Senate as a radical Republican. This was a time when the radical Republicans sought to push through sweeping changes across the South, ensuring that the promises of emancipation were not hollow. Caldwell's election to the Senate was both a personal triumph and a symbol of transformation. A man who had once lived in bondage now helped to write the very laws that governed his state. His presence in the legislature was a reminder that history could bend, however slowly, toward justice. Serving as a senator was not without its challenges. The atmosphere was charged, filled with resistance from those who longed for the old order to return. Every vote, every speech, carried risks, not just politically but personally, as Reconstruction governments faced hostility and even violence from opponents determined to undermine them. Yet Caldwell did not falter. He approached his role with the same steady determination that had carried him from the blacksmith's forge to the halls of governance. He was a representative not only of his district, but of an entire generation struggling to define its place in a country still torn between progress and regression. His tenure in the Senate was marked by efforts to expand rights, to strengthen education, and to secure the fragile gains of Reconstruction. He knew that his community looked to him not merely as a legislator, but as a symbol of what was possible. The respect he had once earned through his craft in Clinton now extended to a broader stage, where his actions carried weight far beyond the town or county lines. Each law he supported, each debate he engaged in, was part of a larger struggle to ensure that the sacrifices of war were not wasted. That freedom meant something tangible and lasting. Looking back, it becomes clear that Caldwell's journey from enslaved youth to respected senator was not a series of isolated achievements, but a continuous thread woven through the fabric of American history. His participation in the Constitutional Convention and his service in the Senate were milestones not just for him, but for the countless others whose hopes he carried with him. He demonstrated that resilience could be transformed into leadership, that the determination to learn could become the foundation for shaping laws, and that the respect earned in a small community could grow into a legacy felt across a state. In the end, Caldwell's story is not simply one of personal advancement but of collective significance. He embodied the possibilities that Reconstruction briefly opened, a time when men once denied humanity could rise to positions of influence and responsibility. Though the era would face setbacks and the promises of equality would be tested and often undermined, Caldwell's life stands as a testament to what was achieved and what could still be aspired to. His presence in Mississippi's political life carved out a path that others could follow, a reminder that progress, however fragile, was real and worth fighting for. And so, the boy who once learned to read in secret, at risk of severe punishment, and the blacksmith who earned respect in Clinton, became the senator who helped write the laws of his state, leaving behind a story of resilience, dignity, and the enduring struggle for justice. In the years that followed his entry into public life, Caldwell's convictions grew even stronger, shaping his role as one of the most determined voices of his time. He understood that the end of the Civil War had not automatically delivered freedom in its truest sense. It had only removed the chains, leaving behind the more complex task of building justice and equality into the foundations of society. That was why he gave his full support to the 14th and 15th Amendments, two measures that carried the weight of a nation's promise. To him, the 14th Amendment was not just about the guarantee of citizenship and equal protection under the law, but about affirming the humanity of people who had too often been treated as though their lives and rights could be dismissed. When he spoke of it, he did so with a clarity that resonated in both legislative halls and community gatherings, reminding those who would listen that a country cannot stand tall if it builds its strength on the exclusion of its own citizens. Equally vital to Caldwell was the 15th Amendment, which struck directly at the heart of democracy. He believed that the vote was more than a political privilege. It was a recognition of one's voice and dignity. He saw enfranchisement as the ultimate shield against oppression, for as long as men and women could participate in deciding the future of their communities, they had a tool with which to defend their freedoms. Caldwell urged others not to see the ballot as merely ink on paper, but as a symbol of belonging and empowerment. His arguments echoed in town meetings, church gatherings, and even in private conversations, as he explained that without the right to vote, freedom was incomplete, a house built without a foundation. But Caldwell's vision stretched further still. He supported not only measures that addressed racial equality, but also those that pointed toward gender equality. At a time when many dismissed such ideas as radical or premature, he saw clearly that progress for one group meant little if it left another behind. He often remarked that justice should not have borders, and that the same reasoning used to argue for racial equality applied with equal force to the rights of women. He believed in creating a society where dignity was rationed according to skin color or gender, but offered universally. That stance won him both admiration and criticism, yet he never allowed the disapproval of others to silence his convictions. However, the world Caldwell lived in was far from welcoming of his ideals. Violence and intimidation lurked around every corner, especially directed toward those who dared to advocate for black rights in the Reconstruction South. He was no stranger to the dangers, for he lived in a time when advocating for justice could invite threats, harassment, or even worse. Yet, despite these risks, Caldwell stood firmly against anti-black violence. He refused to accept a society where brutality could silence voices or erase progress. In public addresses, he condemned such acts with unwavering courage, making it clear that peace and democracy could not coexist with unchecked violence. He used his position in government not only to speak, but also to push for measures that would provide real protection to vulnerable communities. Caldwell's fight was not confined to legislative chambers. It extended into the lives of the people he represented. He frequently visited communities that had been shaken by intimidation or violent attacks, not only to show solidarity but also to offer a sense of reassurance. His presence itself became a symbol of resistance and resilience. He listened to the stories of families who lived in fear, and then he carried those voices with him back to the political stage, amplifying them until they could no longer be ignored. This was his way of ensuring that laws were not written in isolation but rooted in the lived realities of those who needed them most. The challenges were enormous. The pushback from those who resisted Reconstruction was fierce, and the atmosphere of hostility often made progress feel fragile. But Caldwell held to the belief that every small victory mattered, that each step forward laid another stone in the path toward lasting justice. He knew that setbacks were inevitable, but he refused to let them define the movement. His strength lay not only in his words but in his persistence. He never presented equality as a distant dream. He framed it as an urgent necessity, something that had to be fought for in the present, not postponed to some safer future. Through his tireless work, Caldwell embodied the ideals of a broader struggle. He was part of a generation that sought to reconstruct not only the South, but the very meaning of American democracy. By championing constitutional amendments, advocating for equal rights across lines of race and gender, and standing firmly against violence, he carved out a place in history as more than a legislator. He became a guardian of justice in a time when justice was fragile. His life story serves as a reminder that progress requires courage, that ideals gain strength only when carried forward by those willing to risk everything for them. As he continued this work, Caldwell's name came to stand for both resilience and hope. He was a blacksmith who had once forged tools and horseshoes in Clinton, and later he became a statesman who sought to forge a more equal society. His hammer and anvil had given way to words and laws, but the principle remained the same, shaping raw material into something stronger, more enduring, and more just. Each speech, Each vote and each act of resistance was like a strike of the hammer, shaping a vision of America that could truly live up to its promise. His legacy was not just the battles he fought but the example he left for future generations. A story of determination in the face of adversity, and a belief that no measure of violence or hatred could extinguish the light of justice once it had been kindled. The year 1875 marked one of the most harrowing chapters in Caldwell's life, a moment that would test not only his courage, but also the fragile progress that his community had struggled so hard to achieve in the years after emancipation. For a decade, he had worked tirelessly to build trust, to carve out a space for dignity, and to create opportunities for his people in a society that was still wrestling with the meaning of freedom. He had become a respected figure in Clinton, known for his skill as a blacksmith and his unyielding commitment to the rights promised by the Constitution. With the 14th and 15th Amendments enshrined into law, offering the promise of citizenship and the right to vote, he believed wholeheartedly that the future, while difficult, was still worth fighting for. It was this conviction that drove him to organize a Republican rally, an event meant not only to energize voters but also to remind his community that their voices mattered, that their participation in civic life was both a right and a responsibility. The gathering represented hope, but it also carried a silent warning, for the forces of resistance were never far away. That day, the air carried both the anticipation of progress and the heavy tension of looming danger. Families came, men and women who wanted to hear words of encouragement, who longed to feel that they were part of something larger than themselves, that their votes could shape the destiny of their state and nation. Caldwell stood as a symbol of this possibility, his presence a reminder that a man born into chains could rise to leadership and respect. Yet, beneath the surface of optimism, there were undercurrents of hatred. White supremacist groups, unwilling to accept the changes Reconstruction had brought, viewed gatherings like these as direct threats to their social order. They saw empowerment not as a step toward healing but as a challenge to be crushed. As the rally unfolded, those who opposed freedom gathered nearby, carrying with them not only weapons but also the intention to instill fear and reclaim control. When the violence erupted, it was sudden and merciless. Shots rang out, scattering the crowd, and the hopeful voices of the rally turned to cries of fear and despair. People ran for cover, seeking safety wherever it could be found. But the attackers had come prepared to leave their mark. The clash left behind more than bodies, it left behind a wound in the spirit of the community. Men who had come to speak of progress fell. Women who had gathered to support their husbands and brothers found themselves fleeing. And children bore witness to a horror they could not fully comprehend. Caldwell himself, though targeted, stood firm in his resolve, doing all he could to protect those around him, to bring order to the chaos, and to shield his people from the full force of brutality. The ground of Clinton that day became a battlefield, not only for lives but for the soul of Reconstruction itself. The aftermath was devastating. Reports of deaths and injuries spread quickly, casting a shadow over the fragile gains that had been made since the end of the war. For those who opposed equality, the attack was a show of strength, a message that violence could dictate the boundaries of freedom. For those who had gathered in hope, it was a chilling reminder that rights on paper could not always guarantee protection in practice. Caldwell, however, refused to let despair consume him. Though shaken by the loss of friends and allies, he recognized that surrendering to fear would mean allowing hatred to triumph. He carried the weight of grief, but alongside it, he carried an unshakable determination to continue the fight, to honor the memory of those who had fallen by pressing forward with even greater resolve. In many, the rally of 1875 became a turning point. It laid bare the stark reality that the path toward equality would not be a straight or easy one, that progress would often be met with fierce resistance, It revealed the fragility of freedom in a nation still deeply divided. But it also revealed the resilience of leaders like Caldwell who refused to be silenced. He spoke in the days after the tragedy, not with bitterness but with an urgent plea for unity and courage. He reminded his community that their struggle was part of a larger movement, that every vote cast and every voice raised carried the power to challenge injustice. Though the scars of that day would remain, the spirit of resistance did not die in Clinton, it was carried forward, strengthened by the sacrifices made. What happened at that rally was more than a local tragedy. It was a reflection of a national struggle. Across the South, communities faced similar attacks as they sought to exercise their rights, and the violence of 1875 served as a sobering reminder of the stakes involved. Yet, Caldwell's story shows that even in the face of terror, there were those who refused to bow, who understood that the promise of Reconstruction was too precious to abandon. His leadership, forged in hardship and tested in moments of profound danger, became a beacon for those who still believed in the possibility of a more just society. The rally may have ended in bloodshed, but the ideals it represented lived on, carried in the hearts of those who, like Caldwell, knew that freedom demanded both courage and sacrifice. Through this painful chapter, his legacy as a defender of equality only deepened, proving that even when confronted with violence, the pursuit of justice could not be extinguished. Even after the loss of his Senate seat, Alexander Caldwell refused to retreat into silence or accept the role his adversaries hoped he would play. He knew that public office was not the only arena where influence could shape the course of history, and he was unwilling to let intimidation determine the limits of his voice. The Reconstruction years were turbulent and filled with dangerous uncertainty, yet Caldwell's presence remained a constant force for those who still believed in the promise of a more inclusive democracy. He spoke at gatherings, lent his name to petitions, and continued to organize communities who felt the weight of the backlash that followed their brief steps toward equality. To his supporters, he was more than a politician, he was proof that courage could endure even when the political tides shifted against justice. But the same determination that inspired so many also drew the fury of those who wanted Reconstruction dismantled. The democratic machine, rising in power and emboldened by violence, saw in Caldwell a dangerous figure. He was a man who could not be silenced, who still carried credibility among both black and white Republicans, and whose reputation for standing firm in moments of fear made him a lingering threat. As Reconstruction unraveled, voices like Caldwell's became targets, not simply because of what they had accomplished in the past, but because of what they might yet inspire. For men determined to restore the old order, removing such a voice seemed a necessary step in consolidating power. Caldwell must have understood the risks he faced, but he was not a man easily bent by fear. The memory of years spent advocating for amendments that redefined citizenship and suffrage likely strengthened his resolve, and his personal knowledge of the sacrifices made by countless others to bring those measures into existence weighed heavily on him. To withdraw would have been to dishonor that legacy. Instead, he pressed forward, refusing to give his opponents the victory of silence. His defiance was not rooted in arrogance, but in a deep conviction that justice demanded persistence, even when the personal cost was steep. The environment around him grew darker as organized violence became a common tool to control elections and silence opposition. Paramilitary groups, masked by the legitimacy of political movements, spread fear across communities that had only just begun to imagine themselves as equal citizens. Caldwell's presence at rallies, his encouragement to those who still dared to vote Republican, and his efforts to maintain networks of support among black voters all placed him at the center of this storm. He was not simply resisting intimidation. He was actively challenging its power, showing others that surrender was not inevitable. This made him a beacon and, in the eyes of his enemies, a target that had to be eliminated. The circumstances of his assassination were not random. nor were they born of private feuds. His death was a calculated act of political violence, meant to extinguish the influence of a man whose mere existence challenged the narrative of restored democratic dominance. To those who carried it out, the act was both a punishment and a warning. But history remembers differently. Instead of silencing his legacy, the assassination underscored the brutality of the campaign against Reconstruction and highlighted just how much men like Caldwell had threatened the status quo. His life became a symbol of resistance, and his death a reminder of the lengths to which opponents of equality would go to preserve their hold on power. What makes Caldwell's story resonate is not only the tragedy of his death, but the resilience he displayed in life. He could have left public engagement behind after his Senate career ended, choosing a quieter path. Yet he deliberately remained engaged, knowing that his leadership mattered. Each meeting he attended, each speech he gave, each moment of visible defiance carried weight for the people who looked to him for courage. His assassination revealed the fear his enemies had of his influence, but it also affirmed the impact he had already made. A man whose words still carried the force of conviction was considered dangerous enough to be killed. That fact alone testifies to the power he wielded through principle and persistence. Caldwell's end was undeniably tragic, but to reduce his story to a tale of victimhood would be to misunderstand his role in history. He was, until his final breath, a fighter for a vision of democracy that included all people. The violence that ended his life could not erase that fact. If anything, it immortalized it. Generations after his death, historians and communities alike have revisited his name not as a footnote, but as a reminder of the fragile nature of progress and the extraordinary bravery required to protect it. His life teaches us that activism is rarely without risk, but it also proves that even in defeat, the principles a person defends can echo long after they are gone. In remembering Caldwell, we see the portrait of a man who chose courage over comfort, conviction over safety, and justice over silence. His resistance against intimidation, even in the face of relentless threats, exemplifies a spirit that could not be extinguished by force. Though assassins succeeded in taking his life, they failed to destroy the ideals for which he stood. Instead, his story became another thread in the broader tapestry of the struggle for equality, a struggle that would continue long after his passing, carried forward by those inspired by his example. And in this way, Caldwell's voice, though silenced in body, continues to speak across the years, urging us to remember that freedom is never secure unless defended with unwavering resolve. In the end, the legacy of Alexander Caldwell is not merely the story of a man who rose to prominence during one of the most turbulent times in American history, but rather a profound reminder of what it means to stand unshaken in the face of relentless opposition. His life was marked by the dual burdens of hope and hostility, of building a vision for a fairer America while constantly being targeted for daring to challenge a society unwilling to extend justice equally. He was not born into privilege, nor did he command vast wealth or armies. Instead, he wielded something far more powerful: unwavering conviction. His voice carried the dreams of countless people who had been silenced for generations, and his courage offered a beacon of possibility at a time when hope itself was a radical act. To remember Caldwell is to remember that history is not shaped only by presidents, generals, or celebrated figures carved into monuments, but also by men and women whose bravery often left them vulnerable, who gave their very lives for the ideals they held sacred. As we reflect on Caldwell's journey, we see not just a political leader, but a symbol of resilience for African Americans who sought representation in a world still hostile to their very presence in public life. His refusal to bow to intimidation, his determination to keep pressing forward even after losing his Senate seat, and his ultimate sacrifice remind us that the fight for equality was not won in grand sweeping moments, but in countless battles, large and small, waged by individuals whose names history too often forgets. Caldwell was one of those unsung heroes whose existence bridged the gap between oppression and possibility, reminding us that justice is never handed down freely. It must be demanded, fought for, and protected by those brave enough to shoulder the weight of change. In many, his story speaks directly to the ongoing struggles we still witness in our modern world. Though the context may have shifted, the echoes of his battles resound in today's conversations about fairness, dignity, and representation. His life challenges us to ask ourselves whether we are willing to take risks, to speak out, and to stand firm when the tides of resistance rise against what we know is right. For every step forward that history records, there are countless individuals like Caldwell whose sacrifices made those steps possible, whose stories remind us that progress is fragile and must never be taken for granted. It is easy to romanticize the idea of courage, to see it as something distant or reserved for extraordinary individuals. But Caldwell's courage was lived in daily choices to show up, to speak truth, to refuse to surrender even when fear and danger were constant companions. His life teaches us that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to act in spite of it. And this is perhaps the most valuable lesson he leaves us, that each of us, in our own way, can carry forward the spirit of resistance, justice, and hope, no matter how overwhelming the obstacles may seem. As his memory lingers in the annals of American history, we are invited to honor not just Caldwell himself, but all those who fought alongside him and all those who came after, carrying the torch of freedom into the future. The story of Caldwell is the story of America itself, a nation constantly torn between its highest ideals and its darkest realities. A nation whose progress rests on the courage of those who dare to believe that equality is worth every sacrifice. His name may not appear in every textbook, nor may statues rise in his honor, but his influence lives on in the broader arc of history, reminding us that the struggle for justice is always worth waging. So tonight, as we close the chapter on Caldwell's life, let us not only remember his courage, but also carry a piece of it with us. Let us use his story as fuel to keep questioning, keep speaking, and keep striving toward the kind of society where no one's voice is silenced and no one's rights are denied. Thank you for joining me in exploring this powerful journey through a life that continues to inspire. And if this story moved you, I encourage you to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it so that more people can learn about heroes like Caldwell who shaped the world we live in today. Your support allows these forgotten stories to find new life and ensures that they will not be lost to time. And now, as we reflect on the lessons of his life and prepare to rest, may you carry his courage into your own tomorrow. Have a peaceful night, dream with hope, and remember that even in the darkest of times, the light of justice cannot be extinguished. Good night.